Maggie Davis had never raised her voice, not in 35 years of marriage. She always woke up early, tended to her herbs, and trusted her husband, Richard, with the finances. After all, he was the expert. But that spring morning, as sunlight poured over the kitchen counter, Richard didn't hand her coffee. He handed her a decision, already made, already signed. "It's just a small investment," he said. "You don't need to worry. I've got this." What he didn't know was that she had been preparing something too. Not just herbs. Not just hobbies. Something he'd never seen coming. And when the contract arrived, $120,000 with her name at the top. It wasn't just his hands that were shaking. Quiet days and growing shadows. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Maggie Davis tended her herbs. At 57, this small windowsill garden had become her sanctuary since retiring from teaching mathematics 3 years ago. At it again with those plants? "I don't understand why you spend so much time on them. They're just herbs, after all." Richard's voice broke the stillness as he entered with his newspaper. Maggie's smile faltered, but she continued working, accustomed to these small dismissals after decades of marriage. "These just herbs add flavor to all of your favorite dishes," she replied lightly. Richard laughed and poured his coffee. At 60, his confidence often crossed into arrogance, particularly about finances. He spread the financial section across the table. "I have an important meeting with Jeff today. This investment opportunity is going to change things for us," he declared without looking up. Maggie paused. "What investment opportunity?" "Jeff's technology venture. They need capital for the launch," Richard waved dismissively. "Don't worry about the details." Maggie felt a tightening in her chest. "How much are we talking about, Richard?" "Part of our savings." "High risk, but high return," he finally looked up. "Look, Mags, this is what I do. Trust me. Our retirement fund? The money we've been saving for 35 years? Her voice couldn't hide her alarm. To her, it wasn't just numbers, it was their security, future, and the dreams they had planned together. Richard sighed dramatically. "Don't get emotional. It's already done. I've signed the papers." The room seemed to tilt. "You made this decision without consulting me?" "That's our shared money, Richard. And I'm making sure it grows." "That's what husbands do," his tone carried increasing arrogance. "I understand what I'm doing. I was a financial advisor for 30 years, remember? And I managed our household budget for 35. Maggie's voice rose. "You always promised we'd make big decisions together." Richard checked his watch. "Listen, I need to meet Jeff. We'll talk later. It's a solid investment. You worry too much." As he prepared to leave, Maggie felt something shifting inside, pain and determination crystallizing. "If this doesn't work out, Richard, I'll find a way to fix it. I'll get my revenge for this." Richard paused and laughed, a genuine, amused laugh that hurt more than any argument. "Revenge. That's cute, Mags. What are you going to do? Sell more tomatoes from the garden?" He shook his head and closed the door. Alone in the kitchen, Maggie touched the basil plant with trembling hands. "By the way," Richard returned, grabbing his coat, "we'll need to cut back on your gardening budget. For this investment." Maggie quietly removed a withered leaf, not responding. "You are grateful that you can live on my earnings, aren't you?" Richard casually slipped poison into his words. "No matter what happens, I'll always take care of things. Your earnings." She placed her scissors down. "What about my 25 years as a teacher?" "Your contribution matters, of course," Richard replied while checking his watch. "But when it comes to who makes final decisions, especially about finances, well, the roles are clear, aren't they? Besides, starting something new at 57 is difficult. Don't push yourself, he added before leaving. After the door closed, Maggie studied her reflection in the window. Our savings. Our future, she whispered. This is the last time, Richard. As his car pulled away, her gaze shifted to her basil plant. Unlike her husband, Chef Marcel recognized the quality of her herbs, paying premium prices for what Richard dismissed as a little hobby. Maggie opened her notebook containing sketches for expanding her herb garden. For months, she'd been experimenting with growing techniques, applying her mathematical precision to gardening. She maintained spreadsheets tracking growth rates and market prices that Richard never noticed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. Still on for coffee tomorrow? Found those seed catalogs you wanted. Eleanor had been encouraging her gardening pursuits. You have a gift, she'd said. Teachers know how to nurture things, whether students or plants. Maggie glanced at the photo of her last math class. They had given her a plaque, to the teacher who never gave up on us. For 3 decades, she had guided students through complex problems, building their confidence. Yet at home, her analytical mind seemed invisible to Richard. When had she started believing her contributions were less valuable than his? Maggie transferred the basil to a larger pot, giving its roots room to expand. Her movements became more deliberate, more certain. The quiet resignation that had been her companion for years was giving way to determined resolve. She retrieved Chef Marcel's business card. Your herbs have a flavor profile I cannot find elsewhere, he'd told her. If you decide to expand, call me first. Maggie calculated potential earnings if she converted part of their backyard into a proper herb garden. The numbers were modest but promising. More importantly, they were hers, based on her knowledge, her skills, her planning. As she worked, Maggie felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. Richard had made his decision without her. Now she would make her own, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Out of self-preservation. Out of a long-dormant belief in herself that was finally awakening. The spring sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor as Maggie continued her planning. In that light, something new was taking root, not just herbs, but a vision of who she could be when she stopped allowing others to determine her worth. Small conflicts and seeds of doubt. Maggie sat before her computer, scrolling through devastating numbers. Richard paced restlessly behind her, his confidence now vanished. This can't be happening, he muttered. Jeff promised the technology was a sure thing. $50,000, Richard. Half our safety net. Gone. Maggie's voice was unnervingly calm. It's just a temporary setback. Markets fluctuate. This isn't a fluctuation. The company is facing litigation. Maggie turned toward her husband with unexpected strength. You gambled our future without even discussing it with me. I was trying to secure our future. Richard became defensive. What would you know about business investments anyway? Those words hung between them, seemingly weightless to an outsider, but to them, they symbolized years of subtle dismissals and an unbalanced partnership. Maggie rose slowly. More than you think, she said quietly. And I'm going to prove it now. Richard's laugh was short this time, tinged with nervousness. What does that mean? It means I'm going to fix this. My way. Maggie gathered her gardening journal and laptop. Your turn at handling things is over. Now it's mine. With gardening. Richard couldn't hide the contempt in his voice, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. With everything about me you've chosen not to notice, Maggie replied as she headed toward her workspace. The spare bedroom had transformed into a purposeful space. Maggie sat surrounded by gardening books, financial spreadsheets, and notebooks filled with her meticulous handwriting. She clicked on a video editing tutorial, frustration etched around her eyes. Technology wasn't her strength, but determination drove her forward. What am I doing? She whispered, her resolve wavering. I'm 57 years old. I teach math and grow herbs. Her gaze fell on a framed photo from her final year of teaching. Her students had given her a plaque inscribed, "To the teacher who never gave up on us." Maggie straightened her shoulders. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about respect. "Restaurants really pay premium prices for this?" asked Susan, an energetic 62-year-old with a gardening association pin, staring at Maggie's herb-infused olive oil. "Chef Marcel at Bordeaux pays $20 per bottle," Maggie confirmed. "He says this quality isn't available anywhere else." Eleanor leaned forward. "And now she's thinking about expanding. Teaching others too." Susan's eyes lit up. "The Gardening Association is desperate for workshop leaders. Our members would gladly pay to learn this." "I've been thinking about online courses," Maggie admitted. "But I'm struggling with the technology." "My grandson does all that website work," Susan waved dismissively. "He could set everything up by this afternoon. What you have is knowledge people want." For the first time in weeks, Maggie felt genuine excitement bubbling up. "Do people really want to learn from me?" Both women nodded emphatically. "I wish I'd had the courage to do this 10 years ago," Eleanor said softly. "If I'd had someone like you, maybe I would have changed too." When Richard's key turned in the lock, Maggie closed her laptop. She'd spent the afternoon creating course outlines. "Smells good in here," Richard commented, noticing the herb blend drying on the kitchen rack. "Test batch for the weekend workshop," Maggie answered casually. Richard hung up his coat. "Workshop?" "Susan from the Gardening Association asked me to teach a session on culinary herbs. 25 people have registered." "That's nice," Richard said dismissively. "Listen, I might be able to recover some of the investment money." Maggie noticed he still couldn't acknowledge his mistake. "Don't worry. I'm handling it now." "Handling it?" Richard's laugh carried notes of confusion. "With gardening classes?" Among other things, Maggie decided not to explain further. As Maggie washed her face before bed, she noticed Richard watching her. "Still up?" she asked. "Can't sleep," Richard entered and took a headache pill. "Been overthinking the investment. Susan's grandson is coming tomorrow. He's going to help with the website and videos," she stated. "Website? Videos?" Richard swallowed anxiously. "You're not spending money on this, are you? Especially now." "It's an investment for my side business, Richard," she countered. "You have your investments. I have mine. Starting now isn't prudent. The market will recover?" Maggie laughed resignedly. "Or do you just think I can't do it?" Richard fumbled for words before sighing. "You're stubborn, Mags." "Yes. Perhaps that's exactly what's needed right now." After he left, Maggie checked a message from Susan. "Jason can come at 2 p.m. tomorrow. He says your herb course fills a cultural gap in the market." For the first time, Maggie felt genuine hope. The following weeks passed in a blur. Maggie learning website design and video editing from Jason. Maggie teaching her first workshop, initially nervous but growing confident as participants responded enthusiastically. Maggie filming tutorials in the backyard, occasionally catching glimpses of Richard watching with puzzled interest. Maggie opening a separate business account, receiving congratulations from the clerk. Maggie's eyes widening in surprise at her first online course payment notification. That evening, Richard noticed Maggie's laptop on the counter. The email inbox was open, with a subject line, "Gardening with Maggie, YouTube channel reaches 5,000 subscribers." His gaze fell on an envelope addressed to Maggie in elegant handwriting. After a moment's hesitation, he opened it. Inside was a card and a check. "Dear Mrs. Davis, enclosed is $1,200 for the initial order of your herb blends and olive oils. Looking forward to our continued partnership. Regards, Chef Marcel, Bordeaux Restaurant. Richard paled. Through the window, he could see Maggie watering her plants, happily whistling. His hands trembled as he hastily returned the envelope to its place. 2 weeks later, Maggie's phone rang. It was Susan. "Maggie, we have 42 registrations now. We'll need to move to the larger room." After hanging up, she heard Richard in the doorway. "I saw your videos. The ones about companion planting." His voice carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. "They're actually quite good." Maggie looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she said simply. "Do you really think this gardening thing could," he hesitated, "make money?" "It already is," Maggie replied, turning her laptop to show him the spreadsheet tracking her income. Richard studied the numbers, the financial advisor in him analyzing the data. His eyebrows rose slightly. "This is more than I expected," he admitted. "It usually is," Maggie said quietly, the words carrying weight beyond the numbers on the screen. Something shifted between them, a small tremor in the foundation of their relationship. Richard nodded and left without another word, but Maggie could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. She returned to her work, feeling stronger with each keystroke. The seeds she had planted were beginning to sprout, and soon, Richard would witness a harvest he never saw coming. $3,000? Maggie stared at her laptop screen in disbelief. In 1 month. The spreadsheet didn't lie. Her gardening with Maggie courses had expanded far beyond her expectations. What began as simple herb gardening tutorials had grown to include garden-to-table cooking, handmade plant products, and sustainable gardening practices. Her phone chimed with a text from Jason. "Your YouTube channel just passed 50,000 subscribers. Time to monetize." Maggie laughed in surprise. When she'd started this journey, monetization wasn't even in her vocabulary. A knock at her office door interrupted her celebration. Richard stood there holding 2 wine glasses. "Thought we might toast," he said with an unreadable expression. "I saw the subscriber notification on your phone." Maggie cautiously accepted a glass. "You checked my phone?" It lit up on the counter. Richard sat on the edge of her desk, looking more uncertain than she'd seen him in years. 50,000 subscribers doesn't happen to just anyone. Maggie took a sip of wine, studying him. "Did you watch the videos?" "All of them." His confession surprised her. "You're really good, Mags. You explain things in a way that makes people feel they can do it themselves." He hesitated. "Just like you used to explain complex math concepts to your students." The unexpected recognition warmed her, but the walls built by years of dismissal wouldn't crumble easily. "Thank you," she said simply. Richard swirled his wine, keeping his eyes fixed on the glass. "You're actually making money with this?" "Yes," Maggie confirmed. "Even more revenue than your friend Jeff's venture would have generated if it had succeeded." The words hung between them, an undeniable truth. "I'm sorry about that," Richard finally said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I should have consulted you." "Yes, you should have." Maggie didn't soften the blow. "How much have you made?" he asked. After a moment's hesitation, Maggie decided honesty was the best approach. "Nearly $40,000. And a gardening supply company wants to sponsor my upcoming videos." Richard's eyes widened. 40,000? In 3 months. The financial advisor in him couldn't hide his astonishment. "That's a legitimate business," Maggie finished for him. "Not just a cute hobby." Richard nodded slowly and drained his wine. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "I always knew you were smart, Mags. I just didn't realize how smart." After he left, Maggie turned back to her computer. The confession was a beginning, but she knew their journey toward true partnership had only just started. The doorbell rang, and Maggie checked the time. 6 o'clock already, she called out, hurrying to the kitchen. Richard was reading the newspaper on the sofa. Expecting someone? The mail carrier, Maggie replied. He's supposed to bring a large package. Richard folded his newspaper and watched as Maggie accepted the delivery. The box had a simple A Green World Tools logo on it. What's in it? He asked, curiosity piqued. This, Maggie carefully opened the box, is my next adventure. She removed a formal white envelope marked, confidential, sponsorship agreement. Richard's eyes widened. Sponsorship agreement? I need to check it. Maggie opened the envelope and glanced through the documents, her expression giving nothing away. Richard couldn't help moving closer. Good news. Maggie studied him for a moment. Then she slowly handed the papers to Richard. See for yourself. Richard took the page, his eyes scanning the document. The header read, Partnership Proposal, Gardening with Maggie x Green World Tools, National Retail Distribution. His eyes stopped at the numbers section. Estimated campaign value, $120,000. Richard staggered slightly, the paper trembling in his hands. Is this real? He whispered. You're working with Green World? He asked in disbelief. When I was consulting, they courted me for years. But they turned me down. This time, they came to me, Maggie answered calmly. This time, I'm the advisor. Richard slowly sank into a chair, his face pale. For the first time, he was truly afraid, not of failure, but of being left behind. Why didn't you tell me? He asked weakly. Why didn't you tell me before investing $50,000? Maggie countered. Silence stretched between them until Maggie broke it. This isn't just about me. This is about our family's future. Just because you didn't believe in my abilities doesn't mean I'm going to miss this opportunity. Richard stumbled over his words, showing vulnerability for the first time. You did all this by yourself. You're moving so fast. Maggie wasn't sure exactly what she saw in his face, a fear, respect, or perhaps both. But she knew this moment was a watershed in their decades-long marriage. That night, Richard sat alone in the living room. The Green World papers lay before him. His hand shook slightly as he turned the page and saw his wife's confident signature at the bottom. $40,000, he whispered to himself. For 30 years, he had been the primary earner, the financial expert, the one who made the important decisions. Now, in just 3 months, Maggie had succeeded where he had failed. He opened YouTube on his phone. The comments beneath her latest video scrolled endlessly. Mrs. Davis saved my garden. I've been gardening for 20 years and still learned so much. Finally, someone who explains things clearly without talking down to us. Richard saw his wife through the eyes of strangers who valued her knowledge in ways he had taken for granted. The realization was both humbling and painful. For the first time in their marriage, Richard faced the possibility that Maggie might outgrow him. The following morning, Maggie sat at her desk reviewing the final details of the Green World contract when the doorbell rang again. It was a courier with formal documents requiring her signature. As she signed, she noticed Richard watching from the hallway, coffee cup clutched tightly in his hand. Another delivery, he asked, his voice strained. The final contract, Maggie explained. They want to start production next month. Richard nodded, an uncomfortable smile fixed on his face. That's great. Maggie noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Would you like to see the product designs? She offered. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Sure. As they reviewed the designs together, Maggie saw glimpses of the man she'd married, analytical, detail-oriented, intelligent. He made several thoughtful observations about packaging and pricing. You should consider a tiered product line, he suggested, the financial advisor emerging briefly. Your premium customers would likely pay more for exclusive variants. That's a good idea, Maggie said, genuinely appreciative. For a moment, they worked together as they once had, complementing each other's strengths. But when Maggie's phone rang with a call from the Green World marketing team, the moment shattered. I should let you get that, Richard said, retreating toward the door. As he left, Maggie caught a glimpse of something in his expression, a mixture of pride and sorrow that tugged at her heart despite everything. The revenge she had promised and anger was unfolding, but not as she had imagined. Watching Richard struggle with this new reality brought her no joy. Yet she wouldn't diminish herself to protect his ego. Not anymore. As Maggie answered the call and confidently discussed national marketing strategies, she realized that the true victory wasn't in seeing Richard afraid. It was in finally standing in the full light of her capabilities, undiminished and unapologetic. The path forward remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: there was no going back to who they had been before. For better or worse, page of their marriage had been turned, and a new chapter was beginning. Mrs. Davis. Could I get a photo with you? A young woman approached Maggie as she prepared for her live demonstration at Columbus's largest garden center. iPhone in hand, the eager fan continued, "Your container gardening video for apartments saved my plants." Maggie smiled, still not entirely comfortable with being recognized in public. "Of course, dear. I'm glad it helped." As they posed for a selfie, Maggie spotted Richard standing awkwardly at the entrance. She had invited him to the event, her biggest yet, but hadn't expected him to come. "That's the fifth person asking for your photo," he commented after the fan left. "You're like a celebrity." "Hardly," Maggie laughed, though she felt a warm pride in her chest. "Just someone sharing what they know." Before she could respond further, a woman in a smart business suit approached. "Mrs. Davis?" "Irene Porter from Home and Garden Network. Do you have a moment to discuss our proposal?" Richard's eyebrows raised as Maggie stepped away for a brief meeting. When she returned, her hands were trembling slightly. "What was that about?" he asked. "They want me to host a regular segment on their weekend program," Maggie said, her voice unable to contain her excitement. "National television, Richard." For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then, surprisingly, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "That's amazing, Mags. Truly amazing." The PA system announced 5 minutes until the demonstration. Richard squeezed her hand. "I'll be in the front row." As Maggie prepared for her demonstration, she watched him head toward the audience. His back seemed slightly more stooped than before, and for the first time, she felt she was seeing his vulnerability. In the green room after Irene's offer, Richard sat down slowly, tugging at his collar. "National television," he repeated, more to himself than to her. He looked around the bustling studio, suddenly feeling small. Producers, assistants, executives, all now part of Maggie's world. "Mags, do you really want to be so public, so busy?" he asked in a voice lower than usual. Maggie turned to him and said firmly, "Yes. I do." He nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That evening, Richard poured Maggie a glass of champagne as she kicked off her shoes, tired but exhilarated from her successful day. "To my wonderful wife," he toasted, genuine smile lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes. Television's newest star. Maggie accepted the glass, studying him. "You're really happy for me?" "Of course," Richard said, sitting beside her on the sofa. "Why wouldn't I be?" Maggie took a sip before answering. "Because this wasn't part of our plan. Because I did it without consulting you. Because it started as my way of proving you wrong." Richard was quiet for a long time. "I deserved it," he finally said. The being proven wrong part. The admission hung between them, not quite an apology, but a significant shift from a man who never acknowledged mistakes. "I've been looking at our finances," Richard continued. Your business hasn't just recovered the losses from Jeff's venture, it's generating more monthly income than my consulting work. Maggie's eyebrows rose. Is that difficult to say? Surprisingly, no, Richard looked down at his glass. What's difficult is admitting how much I underestimated you. 4 years. Those words resonated deeply with Maggie, a recognition she had been waiting for without fully realizing it. When you said you'd get revenge, I laughed, Richard continued, his voice softening. I'm not laughing now, Mags. I'm in awe. Maggie set down her glass and took his hand. This was never really about revenge, Richard. It was about being seen. I see you now, he said, meeting her eyes. I'm sorry it took all this. Maggie squeezed his hand. Better late than never. A week later, Maggie stared at an email about an investment opportunity, a local organic farm looking for a partner to expand herb production. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Got a minute? Richard asked, holding a folder. I want to show you something. He spread several documents on her desk, investment plans, financial projections, market analyses. I've been researching investments in sustainable agriculture, he explained. Given your expertise, I thought we might consider diversifying in this area. Maggie laughed with genuine surprise. I was just looking at exactly that. She turned her laptop to show him the email. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper. Great minds, he said softly. What do you think? The numbers look promising, Maggie said. But we'd need to visit their operation, see their growing techniques firsthand. Richard nodded. I could run a financial assessment while you evaluate their agricultural practices. Partnership, Maggie said, the word carrying weight beyond this single investment. As we always should have been, Richard acknowledged. Equal partners, bringing different strengths to the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I brought you something. Just a small token. Maggie opened it to find a delicate silver pendant in the shape of an herb leaf. It's basil, Richard explained. The first plant in your windowsill garden. The plant I dismissed. His voice caught slightly. The beginning of everything I almost missed. Maggie touched the pendant, feeling emotion well up. Thank you, she whispered. I was scared, Richard confessed. Watching you succeed so brilliantly on your own. I thought you might not need me anymore. Maggie reached for his hand. I don't need you to manage my money or make decisions for me, she said honestly. But I do need you. As my partner. As my equal. As your biggest fan, Richard added with a smile. And occasionally, your financial consultant? Maggie laughed. I think I can work with that arrangement. 6 months later, Maggie smiled into the camera as the director called "Cut" on her 20th television segment. And remember, friends, the secret to growing anything, plants or dreams, is patience, knowledge, and not being afraid to get your hands dirty. Behind the camera, Richard handed her a water bottle. Another perfect take, he said proudly. As the crew packed up, they walked together through the expanded garden that was both Maggie's studio and their joint project. The organic farm investment is up 17% this quarter, Richard pointed out. Our intuition, Maggie corrected him. Your financial analysis was spot on. They reached the small herb garden where it all began, now expanded, but still containing the original plants that had started Maggie's journey. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't made that terrible investment, Maggie mused. If I hadn't gotten so angry. Richard plucked a basil leaf, rubbing it between his fingers to release its fragrance. I'd probably still be an arrogant fool, he admitted. And you might never have discovered how extraordinary you are. We might never have found this new balance, Maggie agreed, touching the herb-shaped pendant she now wore daily. Richard put his arm around her shoulder. Some lessons come at a high price. Exactly $50,000, Maggie joked. Best money I ever lost, Richard replied without hesitation. They laughed together, the sound echoing through the garden that promised future harvests. The studio lights dimmed as the crew began packing up their equipment. Maggie sat at the demonstration table, quietly savoring the excitement of her first solo broadcast. Her hands, usually steady when handling plants, trembled slightly with residual excitement. That was wonderful, said Irene Porter, the network executive, approaching with a tablet displaying viewer metrics. The numbers are already exceeding our projections. The response from female viewers over 50 is particularly record-breaking. Maggie glanced at the figures. Is this a good result? It's the best result, Irene smiled, touching Maggie's shoulder. We'd like to expand your initial 13-episode contract. There's also interest in a line of gardening products bearing your brand. Richard appeared with Maggie's coat, overhearing Irene's words. Not surprising, he said proudly. My wife has always been exceptional. It just took me time to realize it. After Irene left, Richard helped Maggie into her coat. How does it feel? Becoming a media sensation at 58? Like a dream, Maggie admitted. I never imagined starting a new life at this age. As they exited the studio, Richard paused and gently touched the basil leaf pendant at Maggie's neck. You know, Mags, I was always sensitive to financial numbers, but I couldn't see the true value right in front of me. Maggie took his hand. The past is behind us now. No, let me say this, Richard's eyes held a sincere light. I, who told a woman over 50 it was too late, now watch you teach millions of women the same age that it's never too late to begin. There could be no greater revenge. Maggie smiled. Not revenge. Rediscovery. Of each other and ourselves. The next morning, Maggie surveyed the mountain of viewer letters spread across their table. She picked one up and handed it to Richard. Read this, she said. Richard put on his glasses and began reading. Dear Mrs. Davis, I'm 65 and have been married for 40 years. After watching your show, my husband finally took my pottery studio idea seriously. If her husband can do it, so can I, he said. He lowered the letter, staring at Maggie. I'm becoming a role model. A model of change, Maggie said. One of the hardest things to be. Richard gazed out the window at their garden. What had once been a small herb patch had expanded into a spacious, thriving area. Just like their relationship. Mags, he said slowly. I'm still learning. Let me say it again. I'm truly sorry. She stood beside him and took his hand. I know. 1 month later, Maggie addressed the crowd gathered in the conference hall. Welcome to the launch of the Davis Foundation. She smiled at the hundreds of women and considerable number of men assembled before her, many in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Richard stood beside her. You all know our story, she continued. It began with a husband laughing at his wife's garden and her vow of revenge. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. But we stand here today not for revenge, she continued. But for renewal and new beginnings. Richard stepped forward. The foundation we've established will support women over 50 in turning their passions into businesses. As we've learned from our own experience, it's never too late to discover new possibilities. From the audience, someone shouted, "The Laughed At Club." At that voice, many other women began to stand, and several made their way to the stage. What is the Laughed At Club? Someone from the audience asked. Barbara took the microphone. We're women whose ideas were laughed at. But like Maggie, we stood up anyway. And now, we support each other. Maggie was surprised by the spontaneous moment and looked at Richard. He smiled quietly and shrugged. Just as I thought, he whispered. You thought you changed one life, but you actually started a movement. The foundation office buzzed with activity the following week. Maggie sorted through applications while Richard analyzed funding structures. "We've received over 300 applications in the first week," Richard reported. "Women starting everything from custom tailoring to financial consultancies." Maggie shook her head in wonder. "I never imagined this scale of response." "I did," Barbara said from her desk. "Women my age have been sitting on brilliant ideas for decades, waiting for someone to tell them it's okay to start." Eleanor entered with coffees. Channel 8 called. They want to do a feature on what they're calling the Laughed It movement. Apparently, it's spreading to other cities. Maggie exchanged a look with Richard. What had begun as a personal journey had evolved into something far greater than either had envisioned. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked quietly when they were alone. "Sharing our story so publicly?" "The mistakes I made." Maggie considered this. "No," she finally answered. "Our mistakes made us who we are now. And if they help others find their way, then they served a purpose." Richard nodded, a complex mixture of humility and pride in his expression. Once the primary decision-maker, he had adapted to his new role as supporter and collaborator with remarkable grace. "You know," he said, glancing at the garden where foundation members were gathering, "I think my greatest achievement might be becoming the man who got out of your way." Maggie touched his face gently. "Not out of my way," she corrected. "By my side. Equal but different. That's the real victory." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the fruits of their transformed relationship, they recognized how far they had come from that morning when a dismissive laugh had set everything in motion. The revenge Maggie had promised had indeed manifested, not as destruction, but as creation. Not as humiliation, but as growth. Not as an ending, but as a new beginning for themselves and countless others who had been waiting for permission to bloom. Maggie began speaking softly to the camera. "Remember, ladies and gentlemen, every herb and every life requires time, love, and patience to grow." The camera pulled back to include Richard, who stepped into the frame at the producer's prompt. "Today I'd like Richard to say a few words," Maggie said. "My partner and co-founder of the Davis Foundation." Richard glanced at the prompter but suddenly looked up and began speaking from the heart. "I only want to say one thing," he looked directly into the camera. "It's never too late to recognize the value of the person standing next to you." The camera captured Maggie's surprised expression. Tears welled in her eyes. "Cut," the director called. Perfect ending. In the twilight, Maggie and Richard walked through their expanded garden. The original herb patch remained at its center, surrounded by new growth. "This morning, the 30th woman received support from our foundation," Richard said. "She's 60, starting her art therapy business after retirement." "She's the one who started all this," Maggie smiled. "The potter who sent that first letter." They stopped before a basil plant. Maggie touched her pendant, remembering where their journey began. "If you hadn't laughed at my talk of revenge, none of this might have happened," she reflected. Richard took her hand. "What do you think is the best revenge?" "To live happily," Maggie answered quietly. "Beside you." Through the window of their home-turned foundation office, they watched women meeting while couples signed papers for new beginnings. Maggie plucked a basil leaf and breathed in its fragrance. "Next season will be even better," she smiled. "The garden, and us," Richard added as sunset cast golden light over their garden, and they walked toward home.